My name is Mary Cross. I'm with the International Transport Forum, and welcome to our side event, which is called Charting Pathways to Decarbonize Transport. And I would like to call at this time to the stage three distinguished speakers. First of all, if I might, Alain Flausch, who is the Secretary General of the International Public Transport Association, UITP. We have Mr. Jean-Pierre Loubinou, who is the Director General of the International Railway Union, and Jose Viegas, who is Secretary General of the International Transport Forum. All three of these gentlemen have been involved in the recent initiative that has just reached its culmination, organized by the United Nations Secretary General, looking at sustainable transport. It was a high-level advisory group, and all three gentlemen were a part of that high-level advisory group. Emerging from that, but also in the wider context of the COP22 and the climate change agreement at COP21 in Paris last year, it is very clear that transport has a huge role to play in meeting the targeted objectives of Paris Climate Agreement. Talking about a common approach, and an approach that involves all modes of transport, right across the transport chain. And this is going to be essential to have a coordinated, common vision for how we are going to decarbonize this sector by roughly 2020 and beyond. 2050, I beg your pardon, 2050, thank you very much. Not so quick. To get us started, I would like to call to the podium Jose Viegas, Secretary General of the ITF, and he'll present the ITF's view of how we might do this. So Jose?
Thank you, Mary, and good afternoon to all of you. We know, and this is the COP of putting things in action. And what we've seen is that many initiatives are actually being launched, and they've been announced. Some of them are already coming up, others being prepared for the very, very near future. And we believe they have two very, very positive impacts. The first one is that to demonstrate that these actions are possible. So it's really the demonstration of possibility. And this will hopefully generate emulation. Other people saying, if they can do it, maybe I could do it as well. This is very, very important, because there's always, like in so many new things, there's a lot of skeptics that say, well, it's nice to talk, but then these things are not economically possible or politically acceptable or whatever. So the demonstration impact can be very, very decisive to get things rolling at a higher speed. The other one is that because you are doing this, you are leaders by example. And so you are being copied by others. There's a third impact, which is not mentioned in the slide, which is you will get a data that is very important for those who are trying, like we are, to get the bigger picture of how things are moving and what happens if you touch this button, what happens if you touch the other button. But these actions have two limitations which are inevitable given the local perspective of each of the actions. The first one is that they do not consider the dynamics in the big picture. What is happening worldwide with, for instance, the movement towards stronger urbanization? What is happening because of the evolution in trade agreements? What is happening because of 3D printing? What is happening because of consumer tastes on a global scale? The second one is that what has been done in this city is not immediately obvious that could be replicated in another city. So the question of transferability is something that can be analyzed, but has to be analyzed bearing in mind the different contexts of those different experiences. We try to overcome those limitations by the approach that we've been taking in our project on decarbonizing transport. We want to do a project that produces a commonly acceptable roadmap to bring transport to carbon neutrality by 2050. Commonly acceptable does not mean the same path to everybody. We understand that there are different paths, even different calendars to different parts of the world. And this project has two very strong, interrelated, but very different in nature components. One is quantitative. We are developing very sophisticated computer modeling in which we embrace not only the overall trends, but what is happening in each of those little corners in which different experiences are being made. And then the dialogue part in which we are discussing with those that have taken action, learn from them, and then possibly transfer that knowledge with the information that comes from the model to replications in other places with local adaptations all the time. So it's really the combination of the quantitative and the inclusive, the dialogue, that can produce the results. Each of the two alone is not enough. This is the graphic we've been using to disseminate the notion of the model. And there you see there are those things that are on the technologies, the green dials there. There are all the soft policy instruments that you have here on the bottom with those cursors, like the regulation, the charges and subsidies, and all of those. But then you also have those exogenous factors which are out there, and which have to be considered, because otherwise we are looking at this problem and acting at this problem as if all of those were static, and they are not. The world does not stop. All those changes are happening, and you have to consider their influence when you're trying to model things several decades into the future. We believe these initiatives that are being launched on the ground and our approach are very synergetic. These initiatives will feed our model with evidence of the specific measures and their impacts on the local setting. One of the things we are doing is we are creating what we call a catalog of measures, of things that have been analyzed in the literature, that are being tested in the reality, and seeing if you do A, what are the outcomes, B and C and D, and trying to put all of that in a very information-rich context in which we are aware of what are the local circumstances of that. And then also, because we want through those experiences to help us keep track of what is happening at the more global scale. We believe we can provide a perspective of the mid and long-term evolution of the exogenous variables and how they will impact the local performance in those experiences, but also the system's view of the indirect and induced impacts of local measures. Very often, we are considering just the first-order impacts, but then consumers will react, politicians will react, and this is something that is much, much more difficult to consider when you're just looking at each one of the initiatives by itself. By having this wider perspective, we believe the model can help us see a little further down the road of what are the impacts that are expectable, considering all those adaptations of the other actors. And then ultimately the goal is that based on these interactions and our own research, we hope to be able to support the governments in identifying coherent sets of measures for their INDCs. Many of the INDCs, as we all know, are pretty vague at this stage. We want to have the transport component much more solid, with specific measures that make sense together. And this is something we believe, based on these experiments, based on the research, putting everything in the model, we hope we will have much richer information to support the governments in their own definition of their packages. And then a similar role with industries in their own measures. A lot of the things that have to be done to decarbonize transport is not depending only on the governments, but also on what major sectors of industries, which are large emitters, how will they reorganize their supply chains? That is a lot of things that is beyond the scale of intervention of the governments, and we want to act also on that. This is another graphic that shows essentially this process of dialogue. Governments here on the left, they start with political ambitions and their high-level policies. They will develop their own measures. If we put that into the model, we will have estimated impacts from the model. The governments were expecting that these measures reach these desired impacts. If they fit together, perfect. But if they don't fit, we will be speaking discreetly with the government behind the scenes and saying, this is not enough. If you're interested, we can help you, test different configurations of models that are at the same time politically compatible with your society. Some things that you can propose in your society without having the risk of being rejected out front, and still deliver what you want. So this is a process of dialogue, of interaction, and different simulations of different packages that could make sense. In the end, something very important, we also want to look at the other dimensions of transport-related SDGs, particularly the question of access and the question of road safety. We've found that with just a lot of 10% of data on the model, we can also estimate the impacts in these dimensions. And it is very important. Also politically, for some countries, the question of road safety is much more urgent, politically critical, than the question of carbon emissions. So if we can have in the same package measures that attack the carbon emissions and provide big gain on road safety, it is politically much easier to sell. We have to make sure, as I was mentioning, that we address the whole dimension of transport, of sustainable transport. And that is about very low emissions, yes, but also safe mobility and efficient and equitable access. And this is also covered. We are now in this project, because we want it to be inclusive, we have more than 50 project partners of very different natures: industry, banks, knowledge partners, universities, other international, intergovernmental organizations, and the list is growing. We would be happier if I could tell you 500 partners instead of 50, and we hope to get there. We are now working in the backstage to come up with models. The first pack of modeling results will be presented in our annual summit at the end of the month of May next year. Partnerships here are very, very critical. As I said, we have different types of partners. The countries and the intergovernmental organizations, of course, but then our own corporate partners, the industrial associations, we have 2 of them here on stage, multilateral development banks and philanthropies, and the knowledge partners. These different types of partners, they have different roles to play in the project and different types of resources. We want to facilitate the collaboration with all of these partners, establishing an open platform with full accreditation of the contribution of each partner. We don't want to reinvent the wheels. We want to make a vehicle that takes the best use possible of all the wheels that are available out there, and ultimately help us all go into a carbon neutral transport system in the next 40 or 50 years. I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose. I'd like to take just a couple of questions for clarification or immediate comment. Any burning feedback? Okay, well, keep that in mind then as we move forward. And I'm delighted to invite Alain Flausch, Secretary General of the International Public Transport Association, to the podium. Alain, we know that travel patterns in cities are having a major impact on carbon emissions from the sector. We know that. We also know that urban travel is an area where immense innovation is taking place and driving structural change on both the supply and demand sides of the public transport equation. So how does the UITP see these dynamics contributing to the objectives of decarbonizing this sector? Alain, over to you.
Thank you. It's always difficult to follow Jose because he, such a smart guy coming up with a smart project. And if he's the brain, we are the legs, the body are doing the job every day. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not a Mr. Trump follower, not at all. I'm just there to say that I'm representing an industry which is, just to make an anecdote, some time ago, the chief executive of Uber said how proud he was that in 5 years he has moved 1 billion people. And my reply was pretty easy. I said, every day we are moving 1.2 billion people, but every day. So public transportation today is really the backbone of things all over the world. And I'm confident that it will continue to be that way because just, the world is urbanizing, and in urban areas, there's some limitation that we are not going to be coping if we go on piling up cars all over the world. So the Paris Agreement for us is something we have been anticipating for a long time, to the effect that many years before, we did consider that duplicating or doubling the share, the market share of public transport was a way to mobilize all our stakeholders, so as to make sure that by doing so, we would get all the benefits, not only transportation, but the co-benefits like health, reduction of CO2 emission, job growth, economic development, all the co-benefit that is coming together with public transportation. But we know transport is a bit lagging behind, so it's quite a challenge. And we certainly know, even in the most developed part of the world, in terms of awareness of what's going on in terms of climate change, we're still lagging behind. If you look at the perspective for electric powering of mobility in the next 10 years, even in Europe, will still be very minimal compared to what will be fossil fuel driven. So, however good the Norwegians are in having something like nearly 20% today powered by electricity, there's still a lot of part of Europe which needs to go back. Now, we know how effective we are, because if you just take, I'm taking on purpose New York, which is not viewed, eventually America is not viewed as a really transit-oriented society, but in New York, 60% of the people are using transit, and by doing so, we are preventing around 17 million tons of carbon, saving 8 times more than what we produced in being, electric power, underground or buses. So this idea of transit-avoided carbon is very important in this respect, and I think it's the way to measure the contribution that collective transport, and if it doesn't mean much for you, 17 million tons of carbon, but if you buy every ride, individual ride, it's 4.5 kilo of greenhouse gas emissions saved, which is the equivalent of to keep a 60-watt bulb burning for 1 full week straight, just for one ride. But it's also offsetting the entire carbon footprint of an iPad every week, just to make it a bit real, because in fact, all those big numbers don't mean much to us. So it is really a contribution to this. Now, UITP are his members, because I'm just an ambassador for them, have been taking commitment from the very beginning, because as early adopter of all this sustainable transport vision, of course, we're doing that every day, and means new line extension of line, new powering of our buses is also a contribution. And we have gathered hundreds of commitments from our members that are really helping to get the whole thing going through. And so in this regard, we already delivering most of the commitment that have been announced in 2014. And this morning, just on the African continent, we had friends from Casablanca, here, close to here, or from Dakar, showing how they are developing their project in such a way that will contribute to the climate change avoidance. But if you're doing it already, I want to, as a witness of what we did on the UN level, and I know how difficult it is to work on such a high level. We were, all the three of us, working on this UN group. Actually, I was at the launching of the report a few weeks ago with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Unfortunately, he's about to leave his tenure, but what we obtained from him, at least he promised, is that the recommendation, there are 10 recommendations which are in this report, and he promised that he would pass the message to his successor, Mr. Gutierrez, and that Mr. Gutierrez would be informed that having a nice report is good. I think it's a very nice report, because it is a consensus made between different modes of transport. The aviation was there, shipping was there, the road people were there, the terrible DHL were there, because they are pushing their business as much as they can. The politicians were there, the public transport, rail, and we ended up with a good report, which is more progressive than I had expected. And because I was afraid of being the whole thing being diluted in sort of watered down kind of statement. It's more stronger than I expected. And something which I want you to keep in mind is that, of course, most of the politicians, let's say it this way to be diplomatic, believe that from some time the technology will bring a solution to everything. I do believe that technology is fantastic and that we should embrace it as much as we can. But basically, it's not the major issue. It's an enabler. And the enabler opens you some options that you didn't have before and makes you makes you smarter. But basically, it's still political leadership and building a nice alternative to private car, which is the issue. And then when I'm talking about this famous, or whatever famous, it may become famous, methodology of which is called ASI, which is avoid, shift, and improve. I think the improve is obvious. We want clean bus, we want clean cars, but do we really want to, with technology, to have AVs, which are just a replacement of cars of today? Do you really want them not to be shared? Do you want to pile up again cars, even electric cars, cities? So technology is fantastic as long as it is steered in the right direction. And I think the other A and S are very important. Avoiding useless transportation. The whole car industry is looking for more mobility. I'm not sure it's the right thing to do. It's just we have to make sure that the mobility is useful. And if you, like in Paris, you live on the eastern side of Paris, you commute every day to go work on the western side, it's just silly. Of course, we are not going to change Paris over the weekend. But if we want things to change, we need to combine land use and transport policy. And land use is a major and critical issue. How do we want to organize our city? Do we want Mexico City, sorry for my Mexican friend, to be the model of what we want as megapolis? It is absolutely crazy. It makes people life terrible. So we really need to work on this A. And the second is, of course, more to my competence is about the shift, is how to make collective transport, shared mobility, door-to-door transport more attractive so that finally people abandon their car, at least in urban areas. In other areas, there's no point in forgetting cars, but at least in urban cities, urban environment, to try to make sure. So the real issue, and this was clearly made in their report, is that we need to work with the state, but also with the local government, because the issue is devolved now more than ever. But we need to build a national architecture together with the local players, so to make sure that we will develop some sort of sustainable transport, which is really described in this report. And I think this opportunity, this is about talking with states and local governments. And we shouldn't, I'm sure you're all convinced here of what I'm talking about. We have to talk with the people who are not convinced, and we still continue to believe that the model for mobility is the old one. However terrible is the decision that was taken with the Americans, we should not be discouraged. There is a view for another world, a sustainable world, which is, and I'm very happy that the UN was able to highlight it together with my colleagues here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alain. Any immediate reactions, questions for Alain? Can take one or two. Okay. All right, great. Then with no further ado, let's turn to rail. And Jean-Pierre Loubinou, who is the Director General of UIC, will tell us a little bit about what's happening in the rail sector and how rail is connecting with other modes as well to fully contribute to decarbonizing the sector. So thanks, Jean-Pierre.
Thank you, Mary. Hello, everyone. So UIC is indeed representing the rail sector. It's the house of the rail in the world, representing 1 million kilometers of infrastructure, representing or carrying 7,000 billion passenger kilometers and 10,000 billion ton kilometers every year. 7 million work daily at the service of the mobility of 7 billion people. So that's a pretty important sector for transport and can be considered, I think, as what is called today the backbone of a new transportation mix. We all know that transport accounts for 25% of the emissions, CO2 emissions in the world. We may not all know that rail accounts for 1% only, but at the same time represents 10% market share of the mobility of goods and people. Still, in spite of this good balance for rail, a lot of efforts are developed to improve the situation. And I must recall here a declaration that I proposed in 2014 to the UN Climate Summit in New York and signed by all our members, the 200 rail operators around the world, to cut the emissions of CO2 by 50 and further 60% in 2050, to cut the energy consumption and make it electric and possibly clean electric again by 50% and 75% in 2050, and to improve the market share of rail by shifting. Well, in Europe, it would be freight from road to rail. In the North America, it will be passenger from road to rail. But the concept of shifting to rail is still there. We also have a lot of projects and studies which are going on. I will just name Michelin studying, or a cleaner diesel study, or the eco-tool studies, which are actually being developed to help our members, but also other carriers, other operators, to be more efficient. And I must say, as I showed this morning in another conference, that we are actually on target, not only with our own objectives, but with the objectives of the 2-degree scenario by 2030 and 2050, as far as our contribution is concerned. And I'm really happy, as it was mentioned by José and by Alain, to see that in the recent report by the UN, to which we all contributed in a group of 12 or 13 people around the world, this is rather well reflected. And for the first time, rail has a good visibility as, again, a sustainable backbone for the sustainable mobility in the future. But to have a successful, sustainable strategy, there is a couple of keys which are actually transverse to all modes. And I will take a little time to repeat them. I say repeat because a number of you have already heard me saying this. This is what I call the 5S, the 5 Is, and the 5 Cs. The 5S for a sustainable, successful strategy is first the synergy between all modes. Then, of course, you have to take into consideration the spills and the spends. And you know, if we consider all the efforts that we can do to reduce emissions, we can, in a couple of years, reduce emissions by 7 gigatons. Just remember what this can represent in terms of, well, sustainability. Also, we have to consider the third S as space. Space is very important because this is land planning. This is also the evidence that we have actually urban congestion, and we have to do something in terms of better capacity in transport. Sounds, as the fourth S, is also something which is most often overlooked, but it has an impact on sustainable development as well. And as far as rail is concerned, we are very well aware, especially in dense urban areas, of the impact of noise on the population and the comfort. Society as well, or social and society. As far as accidents are concerned, you know that there is also, for the pollution, 3.5 million people who die of pollution every year. So there is something there as a collective effort. So these are 5 Is. Now, there is 5 pillars for sustainable philosophy, and I would call them the 5 Is. The first I is infrastructure. There is no transport, there is no mobility, there is no accessibility whatsoever if you don't have proper infrastructure. And this is something that must be considered. You know, over the world, road congestion represents 1% of the GDP in North America, 2% in Europe, 10% in large cities around the world. So infrastructure and optimized infrastructure is a key. Now, infrastructure has a cost. So the second I is investments. We have to be very clever in the proper way to invest. We have to bring the politicians, the stakeholders, the financial institutions to understand that investment in rail and other modes is rather important. You know, if you look by the OECD figures, Jose, you probably will not contradict me, but it's probably $11 billion that will be $11 trillion that will be spent in the next 10, 15 years on infrastructure. 40 to 50% will be on rail, which is very good. But you know that if we look at all the combined efforts that UITP, UIC can materialize in terms of savings of CO2s, better energy consumption, this is, in the next 20 years, the equivalent of $100 trillion of savings. So you have here a report of 1 to 10. Is not this a very good, virtuous balance and something to convince the financial stakeholders to invest in infrastructure and rail infrastructure if possible? Now, to do this, you have to optimize. You have to be clear. You have to have good technology, good engineering. This is innovation. This is the key. To have good innovation, you have to have intelligence. And this is also something that must be considered differently in this 21st century. You have to open the intelligence to the young people, because actually they are building the infrastructure, the modes of transport for their own children. And this is actually why we are opening wide arms to universities, why we are opening wide arms to all the startups around the world, which are so rapid in their creativity. And this is probably what we call the mobility to be developed. And now the fifth I actually is the evolution of what we worked for years ago, interoperability. Okay, that is a key. But interoperability has changed into intermodality. And now we are not talking anymore of intermodality. We are talking of transverse integration. And just remember the simple issue of border crossings. If we are much better, much more clever in the better integration of modes to facilitate actually the border crossings and reduce the time spent there by, let's say, 30%, you know that this represents in the world the equivalent of 5% of the GDP, just better integration of modes in and facilitations of border crossings. So that's the 5 I's. Now, this is good. Everybody needs to have a strategy. You need to have also actions. So what are the 5 lines of actions? 5 C's. First is client, customer. We don't do this for us. We do this for customers who are using actually the modes for the mobility of goods and people. Second C is the biggest concern in this 21st century, the development of congestion of big cities. This is very important. 2 billion people in the world will be urbanized very soon, in the years to come. This is the biggest migration in the whole history of humanity. So as these cities are growing, we have to change actually now the architecture, the philosophy of the organization of cities, and look at the centers, not one center in the middle, but a various numbers of centers. What are the centers? The rail stations or the freight logistical hubs to manage the interface between various modes and actually have a smooth transition there for the fluidity of, again, transportation. Now, when you have organized the centers, you need to organize the corridors between the centers. So this is from the intracity to the intercity, the corridors. And in the end, 5C is the complementarity of modes. In the 5S, 5 I's and 5 C's, I talked about synergy, integration, and complementarity. This is the new philosophy of this 21st century. We have no time, we have no money, we have no space anymore to compete like we did probably in the in the end of the 20th century. Now, just a few figures to end. I talked about 2 billion people who are going to be urbanized in the 10, 15 years to come, probably maybe less. But do you know as well that 2 billion people on Earth have no accessibility to any mode of transportation at all? You know that 2 billion people on the world live with less than $1 a day, and that we will have 2 billion people more on this planet in a couple of years. Do you know as well that on this planet, 1 billion people have no access whatsoever to electricity, and 1 billion people have no access whatsoever to water? Probably half of it in the African continent. So it means that there is probably a much wider scope and a wider definition to sustainable development than just the focus on transport. But if you consider that transport is a key enabler to social and economic development, and if you consider that rail is the backbone of this transportation mix, then we have a lot to do together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. Are there any questions for Jean-Pierre? Any questions for? Yes, sir. Please introduce yourself. And I'm very sorry, but there's not a roving mic. But if you would just come up here. There is? Is there? Okay, great. If you'd introduce yourself, sir, please.
Ian Lumley from the National Trust in Ireland. Okay. And thank you, Jean-Pierre, for particularly highlighting the issue of urban air quality. Many of you may know there was a recent successful legal action by citizens in London against the UK's failure to meet air quality targets in London. And that's inspiring interest in similar actions across the world, including Dublin, where I came from, where our Environmental Protection Agency just a few days ago published a report showing that we have exceeded World Health Organization standards on air quality. So the question I really want to raise with the panel is well, we are primarily focused obviously on climate mitigation here, but how can the parallel need to air quality be galvanized with climate action into getting clean air cities with electrified public transport, cycling? We mustn't forget motorcycles also. People tend to think about cars, but if you look at Asian cities and Marrakesh here, motorcycles are a major part of the air quality problem. So how can we combine that climate and health concern more into persuading politicians, decision makers to get more effective action?
Thank you very much. Gentlemen? Okay.
Well, maybe I start. There is no real answer to this because well, as a matter of fact, I was in Delhi 2 days ago, which was the biggest peak of pollution ever, actually in the big cities in the world. And honestly, it was very difficult to breathe. So you can really feel it. And it was, I think, maybe a stage to be a very good or counter example for what must not be done in the framework of this COP22. So I think that the population itself actually is very concerned about this. And there must be a lot of lobbying actions. There must be a lot of indicators that show actually the social impact, the cost of lives, the cost on the organization of the cities. It was totally congested. So again, if you turn all these issues into very pragmatic, factual figures of lives, of time lost, this might actually be a good accelerator to go further into what is already done in a number of cities, which is getting more and more electric.
Thank you. Jose?
Yeah, essentially, two things. The first is that the type of measures that we need to decarbonize is very much the same as to get better air quality. But something that Jean-Pierre already said, I think it's critical, is that we start systematically putting up the data on air quality. All politicians know about congestion because they also suffer from it and the members of their families suffer from that. Sometimes poor air quality is very, very easy to feel, like Jean-Pierre just felt it in New Delhi, but sometimes it's on and off, depending on the winds and how things are like that. So it's not a daily pressure like congestion on many cities in the world. We have to come up with the numbers. The World Health Organization last year published, or just a few months ago, published a number that the number of premature deaths in the world from respiratory diseases coming from poor air quality in urban areas is 3 times bigger than the number of fatalities from road crashes. This is a number that is very, very impressive. We have to come around it and say some of these measures are very urgent indeed. If we all somehow are prepared to take decarbonizing efforts for some 30 or 50 years, air quality cannot wait that much. We have to do quick action. And that has to, again, be based on avoid shift, and improve. It cannot be only the improve. A lot can be done by reducing unnecessary kilometers. A lot can be done by organizing mobility in different forms. And then a lot can be done by the technology. But actually, from the three, the technology is the slowest one. So if the problem is urgent, we have to mobilize the other two components. I would say for the perception of the politicians to go higher, we have to start putting this data. Every time we speak about road crashes, every time we speak about carbon, we have to speak about air quality. And then maybe the message gets across.
Yeah, just an anecdote. I was in Delhi not 2 days ago, but 2 years ago, on the very day where the Supreme Court, because that's how it works in Anglo-Saxon world, the Supreme Court issue a judgment condemning the Indian government because there was pollution on the city and they had reached some level of small particles, which was not acceptable. And they said, you have now to take away from the road some cars that are 15 years old or whatever, which was not enough at all. But what really struck me on those days was that on that very day, in the Supreme Court room, the level was so high that the judges got infuriated. And what I suggested is, instead of having COP22 in Morocco, in a small city, which is still very acceptable, let's make that in New Delhi. Then politicians would immediately realize what it means to be wrong air quality, because it's really like, like you said, you have to feel it. You don't feel it, Jerry, even on a fantastic day, you don't feel it. But if you're in Beijing or you are in New Delhi, then you immediately realize, maybe then you get furious like the judge of India.
Let me just add one more thing. Following that decision by the Supreme Court, the government actually did something, which was to force all the tuk-tuks in New Delhi to go from two-stroke engines to natural gas. And this has happened. They are all now in natural gas. The problem is that they still represent a very small percentage of the total emissions, and the additional number of cars that has been licensed in these 2 years largely overcomes the reduction in pollution coming from the two-stroke engines from those tuk-tuks 2 years ago.
Maybe one more question and then we're going to have to leave. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Engineer Mona from Ministry of Transport in Egypt. I'm very much pleased from your presentation, your performance. I'm asking about, we must distinguish between the urban transport and the intercity transport. And we should know the reflector of the modal shift from the urban and the nationwide, and make it by some indicators to be sense the shifting in the urban cities and within the nationwide. I'm asking, we cannot shift in the intermodal, in the intercity, the shifting from roads to rail. Should we have some mixing between both of them? And we should know also the indicators. And also, we have to just tackle the river transport. If you have any figures for this shifting between the both modal transport, it will be great for us to learn and to be benefit for us to learn more. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I can tell you that indeed this debate between commuter and internal traffic within a traffic or movement within the city is a permanent issue. Because the citizens of the cities are complaining about this today, every day commute of millions of people. One of the options which has been taken in many countries was to organize it. Suburban Rail would provide a real option. I mean, if Paris didn't have the RER, Paris would have collapsed for a long time. And this was a decision made in the 70s. So obviously you need first to have a view which is above boundaries. You need to organize transport on a territorial scale which fits with the real movement of the population. If you have the city of Cairo just taking care of the central Cairo, it will never work. So you need to organize some sort of an umbrella that takes care of the mobility on that territorial scale. and to organize it from that authority so as to make sure that then you initiate the investment that allow all those commuters to quit their car and to have an attractive option to use rail, suburban rail, and to go to the city. But the second thing is also, why do we want everybody to go to the city? Why can't we put some functions, administrative function, business, whatever, in some different pole? And so that's where urban planning is so important, because if you want everybody to come in the city, it's going to be a nightmare for ages. So it's a combination of this that makes it possible, but it needs a lot of investment. In my country, in Belgium, it's terrible. For 40 years, there's talk about RER, commuter rail, and didn't do it. And the city is one of the most congested in the world. So you see, there are clear, nothing is easy, huh? And everything is very complex. But I think there are some general recipe which we can already put on the table that would help you, and figures showing that city with a good commuter system. New York is a very good example. Many people are coming from Connecticut or from New Jersey every day. Unfortunately, they don't maintain their train system. But besides that, they have a good system that allow millions of people to come every day in a sustainable way. If they were to come in with their car, I mean, it's already collapsing in New York, but it will be even worse.
Well, Cairo is probably one of the examples in the world of the cities that need to reflect on the many centers they must organize to precisely have a transport planning, which is much more fluid, rather than to have a congested, actually, center of city. And there again, we come to the intelligent management of the interfaces. Rail is a solution. It's not the solution for everything. It's probably not the solution for the last and first mile. But then the combination with rail and intracity metros, buses, electric buses, electric cars, whatever, is actually something that needs to be taken care of. May I just, it's not publicity here, but I would invite you to have a quick look at a recent film that was made by ONCF to have the smart city development. And I think it's a perfect combination of all the messages that we have here in a couple of minutes. And I'm sure that you can actually manage to see it and to show it. It is a perfect illustration of what should be done for smarter cities.
I believe you are going to have to leave us. So, with great thanks to Mr. Alain Plauche, UICP, Mr. Jean-Pierre Louis from UIC. Jose, you stay where you are, right there. Okay, so we've had a moment with rail, a moment with the public transport, all of its iterations, a view of the sector as a whole, and this decarbonizing initiative that we are all held to. At this time, I'd like us to turn our attention to two global transport means, to global transport sectors, and hear how they are addressing the problem of decarbonizing. And with this, and to address the questions related to the floor, Jane Huppe. Jane is Deputy Director of the Air Transport Bureau of the International Civil Aviation Organization. And we know that there has just been a big success within ICAO to bring its membership to a market-based mechanism. And so Jane will be telling us a little bit more about that. And I'm delighted to welcome to the floor Mr. Edmund Hughes, who is Head of Air Pollution and Energy Efficiency at the International Maritime Organization. And Edmund will be sharing with us the IMO's perspectives on its role in bringing transport to a decarbonized state. So perhaps first, and with no further ado, we'll focus on aviation for a minute. Jane, the floor is yours.
I will speak from the table. So good afternoon all. I would like to introduce ICAO very briefly. It was a historical year for international aviation. This year we had two major global agreements in the area of climate change. In February, we had a very successful recommendation for a global standard for the certification of aircraft for CO2. And very recently in our assembly, we were able to get a global agreement for a global and market-based measure for international aviation, which is an offsetting scheme. But what I intend to do, let me just talk a little bit of ICAO. And then everybody's very interested in the during the COP22 on the global climate agreement for market-based measures. And I have a film that I think I'll prefer to go first with the film, and then I'll make some comments on top of it. So just briefly, we are a UN specialized agency. We have 191 member states, more or less the same size as the UNFCCC. And we deal with international air transport. ICAO was a pre-UN organization, and we have a very specific procedure. Because of that, we have a permanent council in ICAO that is 36 states that represent 191 states throughout the year. We have assemblies every 3 years where we take the policy decisions. I think the film illustrates more of what we do on the environment. So instead of repeating, I'll just go for the film, and then I'll complement with some of the comments.
Commercial aviation connects billions of travellers and moves millions of tonnes of cargo every year, providing the global economy with nearly 63 million jobs and contributing $2.7 trillion to the global gross domestic product. It does this in a safe and secure way while reducing its environmental impact. ICAO has achieved unprecedented progress on a variety of measures that contribute to environmental protection and also to the attainment of UN Sustainable Development Goals. Since the 1960s, aircraft have become 80% more energy efficient and 75% quieter. Aviation, domestic and international, as a whole accounts for about 2% of global emissions, with international aviation accounting for about 1.3%. Working under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, governments can reduce greenhouse gas emissions from all domestic sources, such as power generation, agriculture and road transport, including emissions from domestic aviation. Reducing emissions from international aviation is the responsibility of ICAO and its member states. In 2010, ICAO adopted 2 sectoral aspirational goals: 2% annual fuel efficiency improvement and carbon neutral growth from 2020 onwards. A basket of measures. However, technological and operational improvements alone are not enough to meet the carbon neutral growth goal. Alternative sustainable fuels require further development and maturity to make a significant contribution to reducing CO2 emissions. To fill the emissions gap, the 39th ICAO Assembly agreed on a global market-based measure to help achieve the carbon neutral growth. The agreed scheme is referred to as CORSIA, which stands for Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. Offsetting is the process through which a company or organisation compensates for its carbon emissions by buying credits from the carbon market. These credits are generated by projects that reduce carbon emissions in different parts of the world. For example, by planting trees that absorb carbon or replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy sources such as wind and solar. Taking into account the different circumstances of different countries, CORSIA was designed to incorporate a phased-in implementation. States' participation in the pilot and first phase from 2021 to 2026 is voluntary. As of October 2016, 66 states that represent 86.5% of global international aviation activities announced their voluntary participation in the CORSIA from its outset. For the second phase from 2027, all states with an individual share of international aviation activities above 0.5% of the total, or whose cumulative share reaches 90% of the total, are required to participate. Least developed countries, small island developing states, and landlocked developing countries are exempted from participation unless they volunteer to decide to do so. CORSIA is based on a route-based approach. This means that only emissions from international flights between 2 states, where both the origin and destination states are included in CORSIA, are part of the scheme. Once we know the participation of states and the coverage of air routes between participating states under CORSIA, we calculate the offsetting requirements for individual aircraft operators every year. Each operator monitors its annual fuel consumption from all its flights on the routes covered by CORSIA and estimates its annual CO2 emissions. Each operator reports this data to the national authority of the state. ICAO collects all CO2 emissions data and estimates a sectoral growth factor of emissions. Using the sectoral growth factor of emissions every year, each operator calculates the amount of CO2 offsetting requirements by multiplying its emissions with the sectoral growth factor. The operator then purchases a number of emissions units equivalent to this requirement from the carbon market. Each emissions unit corresponds to 1 tonne of CO2 that was reduced by another project or programme. To ensure that operators, states and ICAO are able to implement the scheme starting in 2021, ICAO is currently developing rules and procedures for a monitoring, reporting and verification system, criteria for emissions units to be purchased by aircraft operators, and registries. These rules and procedures will safeguard the environmental integrity of the scheme by ensuring that the offsets are of high quality and come from reliable sources. ICAO, in partnership with governments and international organisations, will assist all states to put in place the necessary infrastructure to ensure that they are ready to implement CORSIA. Starting in 2022, the scheme will be reviewed every 3 years. Climate change is a global problem which requires global solutions. The CORSIA is a global scheme for the international aviation industry. ICAO is doing what it knows to do best: connect the world by bringing people closer together while reducing its environmental impact and contributing to the sustainable future of our planet.
So I think that gives an overall picture of what we have been doing in ICAO. We have these aspirational goals. We set the basket of measures to achieve them. We have everything in place to get carbon neutral from 2020. What the video does not address is a part of our program that of paramount importance for all of that to happen, which is capacity building. And we have since 2010, when we first put the aspirational goals and the basket of measures, we also came with this initiative we call State Action Plans to Reduce Emissions. So every state voluntarily would prepare their action plan and saying, this is our emissions from international aviation, those are the measures that we could take, and under our realities, those are the measures that best apply to our situation to reduce emissions. A lot of people, likewise, with the global scheme said, voluntary, we are not going to get there. So I'm very pleased to say today we have already 102 action plans delivered to ICAO, many in the pipeline. And in 2013, because of the success we had achieved with the action plans, we are able to secure assistance to some states, including financial assistance through the EU, through the GEF and UNDP, for them to take action. It's very important to note that all our states wanted to take action on aviation and climate change. Some of them didn't know how to or didn't have the means. And a little bit of assistance went a long way. To the COP, I was in Gabon. We were having our 3rd year of a capacity building project that we are having with 14 states in Africa. And they went for not knowing anything to go into the 3 objectives that we had in the program. The first one, 14 states have their action plans now. 14 states have what we call the AES implemented, is the aviation environmental system. They know their emissions. Every time they have a measure, they know how it's the benefit, and they are reporting to us every monthly automatically. The central states in Africa, we have 10 of them. They struggle a lot with the safety, with the security, to be on top, because they are really lacking more capacity building, etc. And I was very pleased to hear from them that with that project, now their neighboring states, for the first time, I asking them to give them some support in one area on aviation, is its own environment. So they are now putting that capacity building to work with the other states in Africa. So I think that this excellent news from ICAO. I'll be happy to share with you. Our next steps is by 2020, it has to be implemented. So we are putting together all the monitoring and verification standards and recommendations right now together. That will be part of the Annex 16 of the Chicago Convention. Is one standard for ICAO. We are going to do also some guidelines for the kinds of units that can be used within the CORSIA and the registries. We will be implementing the registries for the CORSIA. We are entering partnerships with states and with the World Bank to make sure that we'll have everything in place to be sustainable from 2020 onwards. I have a few leaflets that I have put, if you're interested, both on the CORSIA, but also on our initiatives on capacity building. And they are in front of the room. In case you are interested, just grab one before you leave. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. I mean, those are very, very encouraging developments from aviation, and congratulations, because I think you probably had a personal big role in that. So that's tremendous. So what I would like to do is, if you would just hold any questions you have for Jane right now, and we turn our sights to maritime, and then we'll take a few questions on aviation and maritime before moving on to our last segment in just a minute. So could I ask Edmund Hughes, Head of Air Pollution and Energy Efficiency at IMO, the International Maritime Organization, to share your perspectives with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary. And thank you very much to ITF as well for giving us the opportunity to come here and speak with you today and about the international shipping sector and what we're doing to try and address greenhouse gas emissions from that sector. And I mean, I think it's interesting to point out that, I mean, most in this room, I should imagine, have flown in an aeroplane as a passenger, but I doubt many of us in this room have actually been on board a cargo ship that sailed around the world. And, you know, they are different sectors. They're both transport modes, but they have different characteristics, shall I say. And I think that's something worth bearing in mind when we go to look to sort of decarbonize these various sectors, not least what technologies are available to enable that decarbonization pathway. Just to give you an overview of the sector, shipping transports over 80% of the world's trade. In fact, just on Tuesday, UNCTAD released its latest review of maritime transport, and in there it estimated that for the first time ever, over 10 billion tons of seaborne trade was undertaken. And so you can see that the trade is something that is potentially going to grow and continue to grow, and I'll get onto that a bit more when it comes to the forecasting greenhouse gas emissions from the sector. IMO considers it indispensable, therefore, to world commerce, and something that frankly, you know, the globe cannot do without. We need it. We need it to continue to grow sustainably and economically, and so it's something very important. But again, IMO takes very seriously its mandate to address those greenhouse gas emissions and certainly contribute to the Sustainable Goal 13 on climate action, and very much is working hard to sort of make sure we contribute in a positive way. In that respect, we've already adopted mandatory energy efficiency requirements for international ships, and so all new ships now being built have to be more energy efficient than ones built in a period of 10 years between 2000 and 2009, and in fact by 2025 more energy efficient than ones built even just in 2013. So, and we've seen over 1,900 ships now built to those new standards. So we are working and we are progressing, and these are mandatory requirements. So there's something that the industry has to do. On the point of the greenhouse gas emissions themselves, I mean, unfortunately, currently forecasts suggest that with the growth in trade and commerce, and this is using the IPCC scenarios, thank you. The IPCC scenarios that growth in trade will be between in carbon dioxide emissions from international shipping between 50% and 250% by the year 2050. Now, that is obviously a serious issue, because what we've been told by NGOs is that actually what we should be doing is reducing those emissions by 50% by 2050 at least, From currently about 800 million tons to 400 million tons, and essentially decarbonize the sector by the end of the century, which, as I said before, shipping sector, the technical characteristics of it are such that essentially the ships on the oceans today are the biggest machines on the planet, and they use enormous power to move those ships around. I mean, they are essentially mobile power stations with 50, 60 megawatt engines being commonplace. So, and those engines give a power density in terms of technology that allow ships to obviously operate successfully and commercially. So we have a technical challenge to try and replace that energy source at sea in the oceans. What are we doing about it? It was agreed we should have a three-step approach to look at what further measures are needed in international shipping. Data collection would be the first step of that approach, followed by data analysis, and then we'd have a decision making on what further measures, if any, are required. And this was very much seen as providing data for an objective, transparent, and inclusive policy-making decision by the Marine Environmental Protection Committee at IMO, which is the body that was responsible for looking at environmental protection issues. This is just more detail of the data collection system. Essentially, it's going to be applicable to ships over 5,000 gross tons and above. Those ships account for about 85% of the emissions from international shipping. And they will submit this data to their administration, or what we call flag state, on an annual basis. The flag state will then subsequently submit this data to the International Maritime Organization to enable the analysis, as I explained before. This is a regulation, a new regulation, and will enter into force in 2018, with the first calendar year for data collection being 2019. So we'll have the first outcome in 2020. And then you might be wondering, well, what are we going to do in the interim? And I'll come on to that. This is just some more information on the data that's been collected. You'll also note here, in addition to the fuel oil consumption, there's also two factors or proxies called distance traveled and also hours underway. And that's essentially to allow us to have an understanding of the transport work that the shipping sector is doing, because that's an important ingredient in understanding the overall energy efficiency and performance of the sector. Reduction of GHG emissions. What other work are we doing? Well, this year, obviously post-Paris, there was a clear agreement that and recognition of the Paris Agreement by the IMO, that it was a major achievement of the international community, and that IMO had a role to play in supporting the goals of the Paris Agreement. And you know, that we should very much look ahead and try and develop further measures to support those goals. And what we did in just 2 weeks ago, actually, was approve a roadmap for the development of a comprehensive IMO strategy on reduction of GHG emissions from ships. And this will enable the MEPC to address several important questions, including what role should the international shipping sector have in supporting the Paris Agreement, to provide a long-term vision for the shipping sector. And there'll be an initial strategy adopted in 2018. And then this will include a list of activities, including further IMO GHG studies, so we have an understanding of what the emissions are post-2012, because the figures I gave you before were set in 2012, and the estimates, the forecasts were done from 2012 data. So we would like to know what's going on in the interim. And then essentially, moving forward, we'll align those activities with the three-step approach I mentioned before, the data analysis, data collection. And then at the end of that, we'll have a revised final strategy, which will include short, mid, and long-term further measures, if required, whether they're appropriate timelines. And this is seen as setting out a key piece of work for the organisation going ahead on greenhouse gases. And this just gives you an idea of what activities are going to be done within this roadmap. I'm not sure how much time I've got to go through them, but there's some key issues here which frankly are fundamental, such as when we talk about guiding principles for the strategy, and you know, to be frank, there's always been a conflict between CBDR and the principle that IMO uses, which is non-discrimination, which we essentially regulate ships, not states. And so for a very good reason that when a ship sails from, say, Southampton to Shanghai, that it's the same rule set is applied to the ship at each end of the voyage. The emission scenarios going forward, what are they going to likely to be from shipping based on some of the forecasting we've already said, even down to things like the barriers to emission reductions. I mentioned some of the technical barriers, but there's actually commercial commercial barriers as well, which the shipping industry is an industry, it's a business, and it runs on commercial contracts. And those commercial contracts include clauses such as due dispatch, which means ships have to make speed at a certain time in a certain way, and if they don't, then they're in breach potentially of their contracts. So we have to look at the whole way the shipping is organized and is managed to make sure that when we optimize climate action, it's not undermined by some of the business decisions. So there's a whole area of work here that has to be undertaken, frankly, to make sure that whatever measures that we identify, they're identified and they're implemented effectively. Otherwise, we might actually, to use a very British expression, throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't want to undermine the shipping sector and what it does in terms of its service to the world's trade and global community, frankly, which will underpin sustainable development of the globe. So I think that's it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Edmund. That was extremely interesting. And I think what we have here are two very complete sets of information about what global transport means, aviation and maritime are doing to make their contribution to decarbonizing the sector. I will take one or two questions for clarification. So I note your question, sir. I'm just going to see if there's another one that hasn't had a chance to speak. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir. Then please. Very quickly, if you will. Thank you.
Ian Lumley from the National Trust for Ireland. It's a question on shipping. There's one area that wasn't covered, which is research into alternative ship engine technology, because after all, what we have is, like the internal combustion engine in the car has been around quite a long time. Is there any serious research being supported by the IMO for alternative ship propulsion technologies away from the current engine model, rather than just looking at efficiency? And then on aviation, this very impressive 220 as part of the environmental movement. What I really ask for is, could we have more engagement with the aviation sector on what is happening? As you know, there's a lot of criticism for the environmental movement, argument that the growth in aviation is exceeding the progressive emission benefits from each new generation more efficient planes. So could I ask perhaps that we could maybe discreetly talk later about facts and figures rather than raise complicated questions now in this forum? We have to talk later.
Okay.
Well, if you want me to, I can answer the question about the alternative propulsion technologies. I mean, as I explained before in my presentation, it is a challenge to replace what we currently have. Obviously, we're looking at alternative fuels. For example, gases. We heard about the tuk-tuks. Well, we now have dual fuel engines and in fact, main engines which are run on gas. And that's certainly a potential way forward in terms of not only reducing the carbon footprint, but also air pollution aspects as well. And there has been work done on biofuels, but the cost of those is still prohibitive, right, for the shipping industry. In terms of alternative propulsion, you can supplement the main power supply for a ship with auxiliary power supplies such as solar and wind, but the main propulsion still comes from a main prime mover, and the energy is needed to shift these ships through the sea. At the moment, it's difficult to see what can replace them, apart from something like you could to be completely off the wall, a thorium reactor, nuclear reactor. But I'm not sure there's many at the moment much desire for that. But that's what we're talking about. We're having to get that power density, and I use that phrase. It's a huge challenge.
Thank you. James, you want to hear?
I'm happy to entertain outside more complicated questions that would be difficult to address here. But, you raised something that is always a struggle for us. There's a lot of confusion out there with numbers to start. And people have to pay a lot of attention of what is being projected. Sometimes those numbers are combined domestic and international aviation. And again, let me clarify very well. From the 2% of contribution of CO2 from aviation, 1.3% is what's international, and that's what ICAO has a mandate to do. 0.7%, that's under the Paris Agreement. That's under each one of the states in their NDCs to address, like the road transport, like it's domestic aviation, that's domestic, part of their domestic transport. That said, we also have a lot of confusion. So in ICAO, we have a committee that's called the Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection. We really have a set of more than 600 of the best experts around the world working on the technical part of the discussion before we go to recommendations that then include the political level. So they deal with noise, with local air quality, with CO2, and we have a group on MBM, and we have a group for forecasting and projection of the emissions. Every assembly of ICAO, we are requested by our assembly to provide them as a first paper of the assembly, the trends for noise, local air quality, and CO2. Exactly because of the reasons you just mentioned, because numbers sometimes go. So it is very important for our member states. 191 members will be taking very important decisions about aviation and environment. And we have to have a clear basis in which they can take those decisions. That's why the trends are so important. In the beginning of the assembly, we show those trends. Those trends include models coming from all over the world. It's not just one model from one part of the world. No, they all come together. We analyze the data, we conclude, and they agree that that's the basis for the decisions for the 191 states. Those are the official numbers from ICAO. And they are in the charts, and we are very pleased to share them with you. Another area where numbers are crucial is when you have the public that wants to offset their own travel emissions. And because of that, like 6 years ago, we took a very strong decision in the UN. As you know, the UN also have the UN Carbon Neutral Initiative. And the biggest part of the UN emissions is air travel, because we go all over the world supporting our countries, etc. And we wanted to get carbon neutral in the UN operations. And again, every single offset that was being offered had a different calculations. And believe me, from 1 to 4 times the number. So we developed together with UNEP, the calculators for the UN. UNEP took care of all the other parts, buildings, and we developed in ICAO the aviation part. That became the ICAO carbon calculator. It's available in our website. It's available on an app. If you have an iPhone, a BlackBerry, you can just download. And if you want to know your contribution in a specific flight from A to B, it gives you the numbers. We are not an offset enterprise. We don't sell offsets. We just want the public to have the right numbers. So if they take responsible action, they know how much is their share for the offsetting. So that's all available in our website, and you can also download on your phone. So it's very important for us that the numbers are right. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification, Jane. Before we close, I'd like to call to the stage to join us for a final round discussion. First of all, Mr. Mohamed Rabi Kile, who is chairman of the UIC's African region and CEO of Moroccan Railway and the ONCF, and Mr. Amadou Ba, who is president of the Executive Council of Urban Transport in Dakar, and also a member of the Sustainable Development Commission of UITP. So if you both would come to the stage, we're just going to have a quick time to exchange with you and hear a little bit about your experience. So you're welcome to go. And with this, if our previous panelists would need to leave, we thank you very much, Jane Hoope and Edmund Hughes. Thank you very much. So first of all, perhaps we would start. Yeah, Mr. Ba, if you'd like to come here, that's fine. First of all, Mr. Kile, you've been very active in developing a whole program for making sure that the rail here in Morocco is sensitive to decarbonizing and has objectives in that regard. Perhaps you tell us a little bit about that. I think you had a short video on that. I am going to have to ask everyone to be quite succinct. So over to you, sir.
OK, thank you very much. Alors, en réponse à votre question, je passerai un petit film qui trace un peu qui place le diapo sur la connectivité et la multimodalité au niveau de la mobilité. Je commenterai par la suite ce qui est fait au niveau de l'ONCF.
Okay, so this is a video about ONCF commitment for, of course, the African continent and developing not just the rail system, but also multimodal transport, provide greater low carbon access. So Mr. Rie will comment right after.
Zach vit un mauvais rêve. Au Maroc et en Afrique, comme partout ailleurs, la mondialisation des échanges, l'industrialisation, l'essor de l'urbanisation, la consommation de masse ont contribué à un changement climatique alarmant. Sont en cause la pollution industrielle et domestique, mais aussi la pollution liée au transport. Certaines villes ne voient même plus le ciel bleu. Le trafic aérien, les échappements de vieux véhicules, les bruits de moteur, les klaxons, tous ont un impact négatif sur notre santé et notre bien-être. Dans son rêve, Zach pense à sa famille dans son village natal, son isolement, sa pauvreté. Trop de zones rurales sont encore démunies et isolées. Mais ce n'est qu'un mauvais rêve. La ville de Zach, c'est déjà presque une smart city. Une ville écolo-responsable et connectée. Autour de lui, les arbres poussent, les pistes cyclables apparaissent, les voitures passent au bas carbone, un tramway circule. Grâce à la révolution digitale, les transports sont fluides pour les personnes comme pour les marchandises. Les bateaux sont connectés au rail et à la route. Le rail dessert tous les territoires et favorise leur développement. Grâce aux lignes à grande vitesse, l'Afrique est en train d'accélérer sa connexion bas carbone avec le reste du monde. En 2015, tous les États se sont engagés, par un accord mondial lors de la COP21, à maintenir l'augmentation des températures sous 2 degrés. En 2016, à la COP22 au Maroc, une nouvelle étape commence. Zach y rencontre des experts, des scientifiques, des financiers, des chefs de gouvernement et de territoire. Tous disent que des solutions existent, que c'est le temps de poursuivre l'action. Beaucoup constatent aussi que les réalisations ne sont pas encore accessibles à tous et que les schémas et les planifications restent encore au stade de belles images. Pense que c'est surtout le temps de passer à la vitesse supérieure et d'orienter les financements climat vers une mobilité durable pour tous, partout dans le monde. Il y a urgence pour toutes les populations du Maroc, d'Afrique et pour tous les territoires isolés.
Très bien. Donc, alors rapidement, l'ONCF, c'est l'opérateur et les développeurs du secteur ferroviaire au Maroc. Donc, nous disposons d'un réseau de 2200 km. Nous opérons dans le secteur des voyageurs et des marchandises. Nous avons un plan de développement assez ambitieux avec un schéma directeur à l'horizon 2025. Notre première ligne grande vitesse qui reliera sur 350 km Tanger à Casablanca serait opérationnelle courant 2018. On est avancé à 85% en termes d'avancement des travaux. Donc, tout le concept de développement de ce schéma directeur se base sur cette complémentarité et sur cette multimodalité où le ferroviaire est censé fonctionner en tant qu'épine dorsale, où les autres modes de transport viennent converger vers des gares qui sont développées aujourd'hui sous forme de hub. Et donc, voilà, je dirais que par rapport à ce qui est soit développé ou bien en cours de développement, ça entre dans cette logique de la complémentarité avec les autres modes de transport, que ce soit pour les passagers, que ce soit pour les marchandises.
Short translation, please.
Yes, sure. So the network of ONCF is more than 2,200 kilometers, and it's both for freight and rail passenger transport. Of course, ONCF has great ambition for the company, particularly towards 2025 for sustainability actions. There is the first high-speed line that will open in 2018. It's almost finished, with 85% finished, and it will link Tangier to Casablanca. Also, the goal of ONCF is also to be a sort of spine for other modes of transport to link to railways and link railways, buses, and other mode of transport, intermodality, and the complementarity of all modes of transport. So this is the logic ONCF wants to develop in the very near future.
Et ça, une approche très durable par rapport au développement des chemins de fer au Maroc, a very sustainable approach to development of Moroccan rail.
Alors, sur ce qui est de la décarbonisation du transport, ce que je peux dire, c'est qu'au niveau de l'ONCF, nous avons fait notre bilan carbone. Et donc, les transports au Maroc sont responsables à peu près de 23% des émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Le secteur ferroviaire n'est responsable que pour 2,6%, pour une part de marché de 8,5%. Et quoi qu'on ait à bas carbone comparativement avec les autres modes de transport, nous avons engagé un certain nombre d'actions, entre autres un protocole qu'on a signé ce matin qui va consister à ce que plus de 50% de nos besoins en énergie de traction des trains sera assuré à partir de l'énergie propre, à partir d'éolien. Et cet accord entrera en vigueur à partir de janvier 2017. Et donc, et le complément, les 50% qui restent, nous sommes en train de préparer un autre appel d'offres de manière à pouvoir assurer plus de 80% de nos besoins en énergie de traction à partir d'énergie propre. Et donc, du coup, on peut dire que pour le secteur de transport ferroviaire, la décarbonisation serait plutôt à horizon 2020 plutôt qu'à horizon 2050. Aussi, nous sommes en tant que l'Union internationale des chemins de fer région Afrique, on a organisé le 3 novembre, en marge de la COP22, les premières assises de la mobilité durable, et on est sorti avec un manifeste qu'on a remis aux négociateurs de la COP22, de manière à ce que la mobilité, et notamment en Afrique, soit prise en considération, notamment pour tout ce qui est financement vert, parce que comme vous le savez très bien, l'Afrique, c'est une opportunité, c'est un handicap, mais une opportunité. On n'a pas encore développé ces infrastructures, et donc c'est l'occasion de les développer dès le départ dans cette logique de mobilité durable.
Yes, so decarbonization of transport is central for ONCF. So transport in Morocco represents 23% of the greenhouse gases emission, and rail is only responsible for 2.6% of those emissions. But it's not enough for ONCF, so other actions are made on the ground. A protocol was signed this morning so that from January 2017, 50% of the power powering the trains will come from wind power. So this was signed this morning, and it's an important step for ONCF. And the objective in the near future is to reach 80% of renewable energy to power trains. And this could be actually reached in 2020 and not 2050. As a representative of UIC, International Union of Railways in Africa, last week in Casablanca, declaration regarding sustainability was developed during this conference, and this manifesto was given today to the negotiators early this morning.
Thank you very much. The initiatives sont louables. Merci beaucoup. And I'd like to give the floor now, very briefly, and with our excuses, our apologies, because you are a bit compressed in time, sir. To Mr. Amadou Ba, who is President of the Executive Council of Urban Transport in Dakar. Mr. Ba. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I know that I do not have enough time, but I'm just going to try to summarize, because after these global and strategical presentations from Jose, Alan, regarding what is being done at the global level, we need to cascade it in the ground in order to see what we can do against pollution conditions, also against the old buses, because also we have different realities We are the developing countries. We are not at this level where you have already trains and stuff like that. So very quickly, just to inform you that most of the activities of Senegal are done in the capital city, which is Dakar. That houses 24% of the population, on only 0.3% of the population, and all the majority of the population is commuting from the east toward the west, where you have most of the activities, which bring a lot of congestions. Sorry, is it coming? Okay. This is some figures regarding our public transport repetition in Dakar. Both the number one and second, the Dakar Demdig, which is the national bus company, and after they represent the 60% of the population, after and the 40% are informal. So the government need to help them. 30% of the motorized transport is done by public 80% in public transport, but also we have to take into account the pedestrians, as 68% of the trips are done by walk. So, and today we have to be aware that the fleet is too old, 28 years average. And then also these buses do not have really an access to financing. So we have a vision, and this vision is aligned with COP21 and with UITP goals to promote mass transfer, create a significant modal shift. Also, this is going to help or to push people with a competitive offer with new buses to use those buses instead of using their own personal cars. That's why we have a project of a BRT that is already finalized, and this financing is already available. This is going to help us push people instead of using their personal car. We are also, okay, and I know that I do not have time, it's unfortunate, but we have also to be aware that as we have people working a lot, we need to put in place some multimodal exchange terminals to permit people to park their car, use the BRT, or also to walk toward the terminals. And this is something important that maybe people from the north are not used to. We have been obliged to renew the cars that were 28 to 30 years old with the support of the World Bank and the Senegalese government. And we were able to renew more than 1,600 vehicles, which is half of the total number of vehicles to be renewed. And we have started extending it in the other cities of Dakar. And this is the scheme we put in place with the government, have a new industry of assembly, bring a private company to go look for the financing. And then we did put in place some support to the private operators in order for them to manage better and also to put their money in the bank account. To do so, by doing so, we were able to have some achievements like a debt recovery of more than 99%, while in the past people tend not to pay their loans because they were thinking that they were the government money. And also we put in place a mutual health insurance company to help them with health insurance for their staff, their operators, and family. So, and also we are focusing on the training, and also we are trying to push people to understand that by using the public transport, they are also helping fight the pollution as well as the greenhouse and gas emission. So unfortunately, I was the last one to be on the floor, and also I know that we are running out of time, but this is it. And if there are persons that are interested asking more questions, we can take them out of the class. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much. That was really, it's brilliant in such a short period of time. And we're very grateful
Thank you.
to you for being here with us.
Thank you.
Please see Mr. Bob after the session if you have any questions. I'd like to thank all of our speakers. Most of them have left. For everyone who has prepared interventions today and for you for being with us. So thanks very much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much.
It's good to hear something optimistic at the end.
Sorry?
It's good to hear something optimistic. You have figures.
Okay.
You can sense figures on improvement.
Absolutely.
And at the beginning, the opening session was very worried because they had lists of problems.
Yeah, and also this also it was.
When you talk about also